Well, we are very honored indeed to have Madame Lagarde with us this morning. And let me start by thanking you for allowing us to have our meeting here, Madame Lagarde. And we're very happy indeed to be with you again. We have limited time, so let me start simply by saying that Madame Lagarde is one of the great leaders of this institution, having started a very important career as a lawyer in France, in this country, and in fact globally, and then moved to the French cabinet, where she occupied several roles, including foreign trade, and finished up as, I think you all know, as the Minister of Finance and Economy, and did a remarkable job. We are thrilled that she agreed to join the IMF, and I am happy to welcome you here today, and you see in front of you a lot of eager people that would like to hear you speak. Madame Lagarde.
Thank you. Well, good morning to all of you, and thank you very much, Jim, for your kind and brief introduction. They are my favorite ones, actually. You don't have to go into all the details of the curriculum. It's great. It's a great pleasure to be here and to greet all of you from the Bretton Woods Committee at the time of this discussion that you're going to have this morning on a theme that I would like to commend President Kim from across the street for having probably inspired the theme of today, ending poverty in a generation. It's a real commitment. It's one that he put on a very small piece of paper at the time of the annual meeting, where he put 2030, which was the date that he has set for himself as a target to try to eradicate poverty. I'm very pleased to see you, Jim, and I hope that the theme, as well as the commitment of Dr. Kim and our commitment as well, is suitable to you and to the role that you have played yourself across the street, but not just across the street, not just in this city, but around the world in transforming the World Bank in an institution that was actually focused on not just those financial projects in many corners of the world, but actually focusing the institution precisely on helping the world to develop better and eradicating poverty as well. So that is very much inspired by you and the cause that you have supported throughout your life, and particularly when you were, as I said earlier, across the street. And I'm very pleased that there is one big room across the street that bears your name. For 30 years, the committee has played a key role supporting the work of the IMF, the bank, and other financial institutions, international institutions of that caliber. And your efforts to promote understanding of our mandate and your strategic guidance have helped to adapt to new realities. I want to express to you all, and particularly to those of you who follow very carefully the transformation of the IMF and the necessity for it to mirror our constituencies, I would like to thank you and to express my appreciation for the role that you play and for the support that you've extended and that I hope you will continue to extend to our institutions and to the IMF in particular. I will need your support. I'm happy to take questions on that later on. But back to the goal and the theme of today, back to poverty. I think we should first acknowledge that the world has seen major progress. As you know, the Millennium Development Goal to halve the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty by 2015 was met 5 years early. Moreover, in this three-speed global recovery that we have now coined at the time of our spring meetings, with one group leading growth and being the engine for growth for the world, clearly that group comprises developing countries, emerging market economies as well, and within that group, the most dynamic and the one that really experiences the fastest growth is the group of the low-income countries, predominantly sub-Saharan African countries. However, we cannot, pat ourselves on the back and consider that the job is done. There are still 1.3 billion people living under $1.25 a day, and over 2 billion people living under $2 per day. And while numbers are important in and of themselves, they are not enough. It is ultimately about enriching human lives and enabling human potential. And in that regard, clearly, I would stress the fact that even in middle income or sometimes high income countries, there is a high proportion and a much higher proportion of people that are really in need of support. So what I would like to do briefly this morning for you is identify and discuss the role of the IMF in this effort. I would like to talk about economic stability and how it's essential for poverty reduction. I would like to focus on growth and equity, where we have done quite a bit of recent work lately. And I would like to underline the fact that fiscal policies can actually improve equity and lower poverty, contrary to conventional wisdom. I will begin with the overriding importance of economic stability. We have learned, crisis after crisis, that output declines caused by economic crisis are the biggest source of long-lasting welfare issues. Long-lasting welfare losses as well among developing countries. And for this reason, the first best contribution that the IMF can make to reducing poverty is to help avoid crisis. So to fulfill that surveillance and alert function that is ours in order to avoid the destruction of value and the hysteresis that results from a long-lasting crisis. On average, it takes 6 to 12 years for developing countries to return to pre-crisis per capita GDP levels after an initial output drop. 6 to 12 years to reconstruct. Moreover, this is not only an issue for developing countries. If you take the United States, for instance, per capita GDP in 2012 was estimated to be about 9% lower than what it would otherwise have been without the global crisis that we have seen in the last 5 years. 9%. Job losses are another huge cost of the crisis. Today we have over 200 million people still unemployed. The 200 million is the number that you will find in the ILO reports. But clearly, since that, unemployment has worsened and has increased. And the crisis in and of itself put an additional 30 million people on the dole when there was dole. This is an immense economic and human cost. So first principle, economic stability is paramount to poverty reduction. And for this, what can the IMF do? Well, it can help members build policy frameworks that minimize booms and busts, avoid homemade crisis, and strengthen countries' resilience in the face of external shocks. This is our advisory capacity and our alert function. In recent years, we have stepped up efforts to help low-income countries cope with crisis. We significantly increased the resources available to low-income countries, upgraded our lending instruments, and crucially, we continue to charge zero interest on all concessional lending. So economic stability, the IMF can work on that and help out in the process. Let me now turn to my second point, growth and equity. I've been talking about preserving the total size of the economic pie by avoiding crisis. What about expanding the pie and making sure that it is distributed more fairly? Rising income inequality is a growing concern for policymakers around the world. Over the past 25 years, income inequality has increased in most advanced and developing countries, though it started to decline after 2000 in some regions, Latin America being particularly a point in case. This has not gone unnoticed. The Arab Spring, the Occupy movement around the world, though very different in nature and essence, were motivated in part by discontent with these trends, where part of the growth, part of the wealth creation is captured at the high end and nothing is available at the other end. So let's look at some numbers. The top 0.5% of the global population holds 35% of global wealth. So top 0.5% of global population holds over 35% of global wealth. In some countries like Canada, South Africa, the UK, and the US, inequity has soared in the past 25 years. In the US, the share of pre-tax income of the richest 1% of the population rose from 8% to 18% of the total. What does this type of steep income pyramid mean for access to education? For those in the lowest income quartile, what might it mean for social stability or growth? The IMF has started to look more closely into that. Recent work has shown that prolonged periods of steadily rising output are associated with more equality in income distribution. In other words, more equal societies are more likely to achieve lasting growth. Strong correlation there. So equality is good for growth, but is growth good for equality? It may be a necessary condition for reducing poverty, but it has not always reduced inequality, as we have seen in many countries. There is solid evidence that social policies targeted to reducing poverty and promoting human development can have powerful impact. For example, conditional cash transfer programs in countries such as Brazil or Mexico or Kenya have contributed to about 20% of the decline in inequality over a 10-year period. This brings me to my third point. What more can the fund do to advance this kind of what we call the inclusive growth, and I would add inclusive and job-creating growth? In our view, fiscal policy is key. The good news is that in advanced economies, fiscal policy has played a major role in reducing inequality in the past 30 years. That's the good news. The bad news is that this impact has been declining since 2000. Why? Well, simply because many countries have adopted reforms that have reduced progressivity in the tax and spending mix. That is, reduced the generosity of social benefits and lowered income tax rates, especially at the top end. That's essentially in advanced economies. In developing countries, fiscal policy has generally been less effective at reducing income inequality. And this is because tax and spending levels as a share of total output are much lower, sometimes half the level of advanced economies. In addition, tax systems are often less progressive because of a lower tax base and greater reliance on indirect taxation. Yet there are fiscal policies that can help divide the pie more fairly. On the revenue side, there are policies that help build stronger, more reliable revenue bases by reducing exemptions, combating tax evasion, and strengthening the administration, the capacity to actually go and collect taxes that have been levied. On the spending side, the fund will continue to push for high-quality public goods and services. A priority has been protecting and augmenting social spending to reduce poverty and exclusion. For example, despite this long global crisis, 2/3 of sub-Saharan African countries have been able to expand spending on health and education in real terms. And that is particularly true in those countries that have had a program with the IMF. We've gone back to the recent history and have seen that. Now, let me turn to a final subject, which is certainly dear to all our departments, and it's a piece of work that we have produced lately, which was very much interdepartmentally based and relied heavily on the African and the Middle East departments, and that has to do with subsidies, or rather, generalized subsidies. In 2011, energy subsidies alone represented about $2 trillion in fiscal resources worldwide. $2 trillion. That is 2.5% of global GDP. If we look at the developing countries alone, much of these subsidies benefit essentially, not exclusively, but essentially the middle and upper class. That is not necessarily those that are most in need of subsidies. On average, the richest 20% of households in developing countries capture 43% of total fuel product subsidies compared to 7% for the poorest 20%. So at the top end, 43% is captured. At the other end, 20%. 6 times more. Sorry, 43%, 7%. If you look at both, 20% top, 20% bottom. So these subsidies, well intended, are not reaching the poorest households and are diverting public resources away from spending on health and education. In addition, I don't have to say that, particularly now that we know that we've exceeded this 400 threshold measured in Hawaii. Clearly, targeting those subsidies, reducing them in essence, and making them more efficient would certainly contribute to the planet and would reduce CO2 emissions by an estimated 13%. So let me conclude with a word on institution and governance. As you know, strong institutions and accountability go hand in hand with economic stability, sustained growth, and human development. The book Why Nations Fail by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson made a very convincing case for this. Institutions must be accountable to taxpayers and citizens. Otherwise, striving to reduce poverty is like building a house on a bed of sand. Quote. Good governance also matters at the IMF, especially at the IMF. In an ever-changing world, we must mirror our evolving membership. So we are pressing ahead with our quota and governance reform of 2010. We have made great progress, but the leadership of our largest shareholder is critical at this very moment. As you may know, the US authorities recently submitted the 2010 package of governance and quota reform as a supplement to the budget. We welcome this and we hope for prompt approval, much needed. With that happening, it will trigger the implementation of the 2010 reform. Governance, followed by the quota reform that was committed to more than 4 years ago now. So with that, dear Jim, I would like to thank again the Bretton Woods Committee for your support on this issue and simply mention that I'm going to need you even more. To sum up, I would like to say that I fully support President Kim's goal to end extreme poverty by 2030, and I certainly pledge to work together with him and his team on this. With the right partnership, the right policies, the right focus, we can indeed see the end of poverty in our generation. I was thinking to myself that I'll be way over 70 and probably not as active as you have been, Jim, but I would really love to see that happening in my lifetime. And I will finish with a quote by Muhammad Yunus, who said, "Once poverty is gone, we'll need to build museums to display its horrors to future generations. They'll wonder why poverty continued so long in human society and how a few people could live in luxury while billions dwelt in misery, deprivation, and despair." I look forward to this day and to your work on these issues. Thank you.
Madame Lagarde, thank you so much. I'm wondering if I could ask you to expand a little bit on what's happening on the ratification of the quotas. They seem to have been around since 2010, and I've missed out on what's been happening, and I think people here might be interested to know what is happening at the moment.
Okay. What was agreed and called the 2010 reform was the agreement of G20 and the IMFC, of course, to do two things. One was to change the governance of the IMF by essentially reducing the number of European chairs to the benefit of underrepresented countries, particularly the emerging and dynamic economies, to eliminate the 7 non-elected chairs. And once that governance reform was triggered by an 85% majority, that would immediately increase the quota by 100%, so it's the doubling of the quota, provided that there was a majority of 70% to increase the quota by twofold, plus a minimum number of countries. Now, we have fulfilled the two first criteria. More than 70% of the members have agreed to double the quotas. We have the required number of members signing up to that. But on the governance reform, we have not hit the threshold of the 85% majority. And we are short of a few members, but one in particular that I have just mentioned, which is the United States of America, which hopefully will ratify this reform in the short run. It's been, as I mentioned in my remarks, included in the budget that will go to Congress that is being discussed at the moment. And once that is ratified, if it is ratified, then automatically the governance reform will be effective, and that will trigger immediately the doubling of the quota. And the 2010 governance and quota reform that was vetted by the IMFC, which is our ultimate governing board, and by the G20, will be reflected in the articles, the bylaws, and our financials. At the same time, we are also working on the quota formula reform, which is also intended to be upgraded, updated, improved in order to better reflect the composition of our membership and to mirror better the evolution of economic powers. That's where we are. So I'm anxiously waiting for that 85% threshold to be hit.
And the United States is sort of key in that, is it?
It's a key member. It's my biggest shareholder, so to speak, and it can trigger the whole thing.
Good. I'm going to ask one more question, but may I invite all of you to ask questions, and there are microphones around the room, and if you just go and stand next to one when you're ready to speak, we'd be very pleased. If not, I will have a wonderful conversation with Madame Lagarde. But I do invite you to do it because it's a very unusual opportunity. I have one other question which is more general, and it relates to the fact that in the period when you started in the ministry and in the various ministries, and when I was also starting, we had this world in which the OECD countries had 80% of the global GDP. And of course, more recently, China and some other countries have been increasing the percentage of global GDP moving to Asia. And some analysts would say that by 2050, the OECD countries, instead of 80%, will have 35 to 40% of global GDP. And that more than 50% will be in Asia. And that a lot of the countries which we regarded as developing will be in the top 20. How is the reaction of your board to think, and your shareholders, to think to the future about those issues?
I think the membership and the board are accepting that principle of evolution and the fact that there is a momentum, exactly as you described. And it is so true that once the 2010 reform is implemented, all the emerging market economies will be in my top 10 list of shareholders. So it's a process, and although some argue and regret that it's lagging a little bit, yet it's adjusting to reality. And it will have to continue to adjust to reality. Now, Mr. Gurria, the head of the OECD, would argue that, of course, by then it will include the 80% because he will have invited and included in his institution all the emerging and developing countries, which is clearly not the case for the moment.
Thank you. Please.
Good morning. I'm Paul Applegarth. Over the last couple of years, the IMF has had a real-world laboratories on the trade-offs between austerity, budget discipline, and stimulus and growth. I'm wondering what lessons you see the institution having learned over that time, how it might change the way it acts going forward.
Well, thank you so much for coupling austerity with budget discipline. And I would hope that by further clarifying what we mean when we give fiscal consolidation recommendation, what we mean is fiscal discipline, budgetary discipline, proper balance between reducing spendings and refocusing taxes, and in some cases increasing them. I think it's been wrapped up under the generic word of austerity, which I think is just not the right. It certainly does not coincide with what we stand for. And when we say fiscal discipline is needed, it is not mutually exclusive from growth. So we can very well see fiscal discipline to get. Oh my goodness, that must have been very strong fiscal discipline. Thank you. So we see very much fiscal discipline together with growth. They are not incompatible, and they should go hand in hand. If I have personally learned something from the many reviews that we've seen in the last 2 years and the thinking of our research department, is that when fiscal discipline is required as compost for growth, if you will, and it's the case in multiple areas of a very strong economic region, as was the case in Europe, for instance, particularly in the Eurozone. Time is of the essence. And by that I mean probably more time than was initially considered, and certainly more time than was envisaged in other programs in, say, Southeast Asia or Latin American countries, where prompt, harsh, fast fiscal consolidation, however difficult and hard on the people, was actually helpful and positive in its output. So you asked me what I've learned. Time is of the essence, and enough time should be given for that fiscal consolidation to set in society and government, while allowing growth to pick up and to develop at the same time. And it's that parallel between fiscal consolidation and growth that is a fine-tuning exercise and needs to be backed by appropriate monetary policy, the rapid implementation of structural reforms that do not necessarily produce a return right away, but will in due course pick up from the fiscal consolidation combined with monetary policy. That's in a nutshell what I've learned.
Thank you. Would you also give your name, please? Thank you,
Yes,
ma'am.
hello, good morning. My name is Dr. Elvira Barra-Cochia, and I want to thank you for really giving this vision about really how we can really advance economic reform. I think economic reform is really about improving human growth and development, as you said. So I was wondering if you could expand more on the investments that you said that some Saharan countries have done in health and education. As everybody knows, that of all the MDGs, MDG 5, which is maternal health, is very back behind. So really improving the well-being of half of the population of the country, and in the world, women is a priority. So I was wondering if you could expand on that. Thank you.
I'm not going to give you numbers because I don't want to get them wrong, but we have conducted a study comparing the health and education spending. I'm not sure that we've specifically narrowed it down to maternal care, but certainly general health spendings and education spending in countries with programs sponsored and supported by the IMF, and countries without programs, because it was often the case that people argued that the IMF was not focused on those issues. Well, we are actually focused on those issues. Sure. And it so happens that those countries with IMF program have actually consistently spent more on health and education than the group of the others. Mm-hmm. So I'll make sure that you have access. Well, great. There is access, but I will make sure that you have that study in hand so you have the numbers.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Merci, Madame. I'm Gary Kleiman, Kleiman International Consultants. I want to ask in reference to the fund's work in low-income economies. You recently issued a warning pertinent to sub-Saharan Africa in particular. As we know, many of these countries have easy access, given global monetary conditions, to external bond markets. Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia have all gotten a lot of money. And the IMF practice in the past was to impose strict ceilings on non-concessional borrowing. In addition to the warning that was issued about the rapid reaccumulation of external debt in sub-Saharan Africa, which will apply to other low-income economies in different regions. Do you foresee any change in the IMF's approach, given that the window may remain open fairly indefinitely for external commercial borrowing?
I think that we will remain very attentive and very alert to this recent development that you've alluded to. Issuance of bonds by some of the countries that did not do that so much in the past, and certainly the flow of capital towards some of those countries, particularly those with valuable commodities, including agrarian land, access to water resources, and obviously the traditional commodities such as oil and various other ones. So I think we will clearly focus on that because it's part of the spillover exercise that we have to conduct in relation to capital flows. We have to be very attentive to the consequential effects of monetary policies that have been implemented from most advanced economies and the impact that it has in those markets in particular. Because while in a way it's providential, but in another way it could be a significant vulnerability for them depending on what form it takes in those countries.
Thank you. Alessandro Pio from the Asian Development Bank office in Washington. You have mentioned the importance of fiscal policy and the importance of taking a long-term perspective. I would like for you to elaborate a bit more on the impact of monetary policies. We have seen an incredible amount of easing of monetary policies worldwide. In the short term, that has an impact on capital flows and possibly exchange rates and export potential for many of the countries in Asia, like Mr. Wolfenson mentioned. But in the long term, it could eventually lead to significant inflation at the time when the economy picks up. And we know inflation also has a significant impact on the poor in the long term. So how comfortable are we with that we would be able in due time to manage the re-entry from such a large quantitative easing at the moment?
That's a big question. And I'll try to be brief and yet not miss too much of the answer. One is we believe that the current accommodative monetary policies are desirable. Number two, when implemented, they have to be very attentive not only to their direct effect in their domestic market, but also to the spillover effect it has outside the domestic market. Number three, it has to be very, how would I put it, tailored to the structure of those economies where they're put in place in order to make sure that the monetary transmission actually works. That's issue number one. It's all very well having it, but you have to make sure that it actually produces effects in that economy where it's put in place. On the issue of inflation, at the moment at least, in those countries, inflation is not an issue, and core inflation is very much under the targets that have been used historically or even revised recently by countries like Japan. And if we look at the sub-Saharan African countries, for instance, in those countries where inflation was very high, it has significantly reduced over the last couple of years. In many of those countries, it has halved. So I would say that while it has to be our medium-term concern, and we have to really keep our eyes on that indicator, for the moment, it's reasonable and okay. The real risk, or the real challenge for all is proper monetary transmission in these economies, spillover effects out there in those countries where capitals flow, and more to the point, what happens next, which is something that clearly has to be properly thought through, concerted, or at least done on a properly coordinated basis with that twofold concern, domestic and spillover. And we'll be a companion to the central banks on that particular journey, with a view to alerting them and helping to avoid the negative consequences of what they will have to do.
We have two more questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Mahesh
Address
Kochacha,
and talk.
SCIC New York. My question, Madam Lagarde, is on the issue of fragile states. You mentioned stability, economic stability. You did not talk so much about political stability. Many states are, for economic or political reasons, very fragile. There are something like 25 countries, according to various different definitions, and there are a substantial number of people in those countries, and I would imagine that their ability to return to pre-crisis situations is delayed longer than 6 to 12 years that you mentioned for economically unstable situations. So what is your thinking about this, and what is the role of Bretton Woods institutions, in particular IMF, in this respect? Thank you.
You're quite right to mention the fragile states and the fact that many of our numbers, many of our assessments have to be differentiated depending on the political situation and the evolution of political situation. I would just comment, not focusing especially on fragile states, but I'm not going to say anything about political stability or instability yet. It's right front and center whenever we put in place a program, whenever we put in place technical assistance at the request of the country. Because if we do not have the political endorsement and ownership, then our efforts are in vain. And obviously, it belongs to other actors to push for that political stability. But to the extent that you believe that political stability and economic stability go hand in hand, we are a player. And we push from our economic angle whatever can contribute to overall stability for those states. We've had the case recently of, I know they don't necessarily fall in this category that you have in mind, but we've been doing quite a lot of work with Yemen, for instance. We've been doing quite a lot of work with the Sudan's nations. We are very pleased to have now included, or reinstated, if you will, as a member, Somalia. And in all those countries, we either have programs in place or we provide capacity building technical assistance in order to help them build their state, build their treasury function, build their tax institutions in order to bring that level of economic stability that is so much needed. And whenever you read in reports or commentators' papers that there is negotiations going on, but it's not moving, or it's lagging behind, or it's slow, you can be almost, in all cases, certain that the break is political ownership, political stability that we need to make sure the program is going to work.
One final question.
My name is Angela. I'm a graduate student from Georgetown University. Since you ended your speech using the quote from Muhammad Yunus, the father of microfinance, so I have a question about that. So what do you think the IMF could do to provide those people who don't have the access to the regular financial market the same opportunity like other people? And do you think microfinance, microcredit, and other untraditional financial methods would be a good way to end poverty?
First of all, let me say that personally, I'm convinced of the values and virtues of microfinance if conducted well and with a view to empowering people to actually conduct their project and develop their activity, not with a single purpose of generating massive profit on the back of those receiving microcredit. I'm even more so in favor of it because I know that it's an area of financing that benefit essentially women because they're better debtors than men for microcredit institutions. So I'm very keen that this be used as much as possible because I'm personally convinced that for development purposes, the best way to go is to actually empower women, to educate, to make sure that they have access to education, and to make sure that they have access to finance. So I'm 200% supportive of microcredit, and whenever we are engaged, involved, or called on duty, we certainly pay attention to that and support it.
Thank you.
Well, we're exactly on time, and I want to thank you most sincerely for coming along, and you have lived up to every expectation, and we're very grateful to you.
Thank you so much.